In 2007, I, a man from Denmark, planned a fishing trip deep into the forest of Sweden with my friend, Jacob. We journeyed far into the woods, taking in the breathtaking beauty around us. We didn't really pay attention to where we were going or how deep we had ventured. Eventually, we found a perfect little sandy beach to set up and fish. As time passed, we were completely absorbed in our fishing when we noticed something unusual: footprints in the sand. Upon closer inspection, they appeared to be bear tracks. Now, they always say not to run from a predator, but in that moment, it was hard not to panic. Suddenly, we began to hear rustling from the nearby bushes. Jacob and I froze, straining to listen as the whole forest seemed to fall silent. We just stood there, holding our fishing poles, staring at the bushes, waiting to see what was in them. Then, a snout emerged. We jumped back, ready to flee, when a large bear stepped out of the underbrush. It was a shock. We weren't used to encountering such a massive animal back in Denmark. We instinctively began to back away. The bear, however, didn't seem particularly interested in us. Slowly and cautiously, we started making our way back in the direction we thought was our camp, but we hadn't paid enough attention to our surroundings, so we quickly realized we were lost. Panic set in. We wandered in circles through the woods, feeling completely disoriented. What we didn't realize was that the bear had decided to follow us. As soon as we realized we were being stalked, fear overtook us. We exchanged a glance, nodded to each other, and started running. Despite all the advice we'd heard about not running from predators, there was no time to think. We only looked back occasionally to see if the bear was getting closer. I couldn't help but think about how I was going to meet my end, lost in the woods, far from home. Then 2 deafening gunshots rang out. It was a hunter sitting high up in a tree stand. We froze, catching our breath, and the hunter descended. He told us how lucky we were that he spotted us running from the bear, which had been following us the whole time. We hadn't realized just how close we were to danger. We explained how we had gotten lost, and the hunter kindly guided us back to the right trail. I never got his name, but I'll forever be grateful to him. Thank you, stranger, for saving our lives. Thanks for tuning in to another chilling episode of Unexplained Encounters. If you have a story you'd like shared on the show, visit darkstories.org. Unexplained Encounters is an original series from Eerie Cast. Explore more horror-themed podcasts at eeriecast.com, including Redwood Bureau, Freaky Folklore, Destination Terror, and Tales from the Break Room. Want to support us and enjoy fewer ads? Sign up for Eerie Cast Plus at eeriecast.com. Until next time, stay safe, stay creepy, because this world is full of strange and unsettling things. Music. I live in a semi-rural area in Vermont, where it's mostly peaceful, but the people here can sometimes be a bit strange. This story took place about 2 years ago in 2020 during June, when my friends and I were about to graduate from high school. We had all planned on going to the graduation ceremony and hanging around afterward, but one of my buddies suggested we check out an abandoned racetrack his cousin told him about. It seemed pretty cool, and we could have a party there instead. We all agreed to go. On the day of the trip, we spent our time getting food, drinks, and other supplies for a good time. Around 2:30 p.m., we headed out to the racetrack, which was about an hour's drive from where we lived. The drive wasn't a big deal to us. On the way there, my friend dropped a bomb on us. Hey, this racetrack is abandoned. I'm not sure what's inside, but my cousin mentioned that there are supposed to be people living in the basement. We all chuckled, dismissing the idea of people hiding out in an abandoned racetrack. When we arrived, we saw that the place was massive. We parked near the basement entrance for an easy escape if needed, got our things together, and headed inside. As we entered, we noticed a pillar with the words, "Welcome to Hell Run," spray painted on it. That seemed pretty odd, but we kept moving forward. We eventually reached the 3rd floor and discovered that we couldn't go any higher due to a collapse. So we set up camp there and the party began. After everyone had a decent buzz going, we decided to explore the place by playing a game of manhunt. The entire building was only lit by moonlight, making it pitch black inside. My close friend, Susan, and I started looking for the rest of our friends, beginning in the basement. As soon as we stepped inside the basement, an awful stench hit us, like old books mixed with decomposing things. We continued deeper into the basement when we heard footsteps shuffling around. We thought it was one of our friends, so I moved toward the sound, trying to surprise the person and figure out who it was. I was wrong. A few minutes later, we found a mask sitting on a table. It appeared to be made from animal skin stitched together. Both of us found it quite disturbing and decided to warn the others that we weren't alone. We made our way back to the stairs that led to the 3rd floor when suddenly, a bottle shattered next to Susan's feet. She screamed in shock. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just one of our friends playing a prank. I looked up the stairs and saw my friend laughing as he tossed the bottle. But when I turned in a different direction, I froze in fear. At the end of the 2nd floor were 2 cloaked figures wearing masks. I immediately told Susan to run, and she shouted, "That's not funny." So I picked her up and forced her to look at what I was seeing. She screamed again. The chase was on. Those cloaked figures started walking toward us. I screamed to the rest of my friends that we weren't alone in there. As Susan and I ran for it, my friends came rushing down from a different stairway and met us at the front entrance. It took me a moment to catch my breath and explain what I had seen. After I finished, my friend grabbed a 12-gauge Winchester shotgun from his truck, saying, "There's no way," but he was interrupted when one of those figures appeared in front of us. My other friend, who was with us, calmly handed me his pistol, saying, "You stay with Susan. You guys go grab our things." 2 more of my friends and I went back inside, taking an alternate route to the 2nd floor stairs. Along the way, we noticed that the basement door was wide open. We approached the door and saw light coming from within. I kicked the door open and found a pentagram surrounded by candles. Near it was the mask I had pointed out earlier, but what really unnerved me was noticing the wall torn apart, with the words, "Death Leap," scrawled above a huge hole. Looking inside the hole, I saw that it led all the way to the basement. We quickly left the room and grabbed our things. As we were leaving, we saw 6 or 7 figures moving away from the side of the building. They seemed to be leaving, but we didn't pay much attention. We packed everything up and drove away. But as we were pulling out, those same figures suddenly stopped and began to stare at us. None of us have returned since that day. All of us just brushed it off as some kind of satanic worshippers trying to mess with me and my friends, and I really hope that's all it was. This is my experience with a creature in the woods. My name is Sam, and I was living in Pennsylvania when this happened, sometime between the ages of 10 and 12. Our school had planned a camping trip to the Pine Ridge Forest, and being the adventurous type, I immediately signed up. The trip was scheduled for the winter, so we bundled up in our warm clothes before heading out for the 3-day adventure. The journey began like any other. We boarded the bus. Our teachers grouped us together, and we unloaded our camping gear once we arrived. We quickly set to work with setting up our camp. However, as we worked, I had this strange feeling that someone was watching me. I dismissed it, thinking there were just animals around. But as soon as I thought this, I heard a howl echo from the woods. Startled, I dropped the hammer I was holding. My friend tried to assure me it was nothing, but the sound was not just animal-like. It had a human quality mixed with something more primal, like a wolf, but distorted. It was hard to describe, and honestly, I didn't feel right about it, but I tried to ignore it and continue with the trip. That night, As we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and singing, everything seemed normal. Hours passed, and the fire started to die down. We were sent in different directions to gather more wood. I decided to venture into the darker, more ominous section of the forest. It was just who I was, curious and fearless. After about 10 minutes of picking up sticks, I realized the forest was too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels wrong. Then, I heard a twig snap near the tree line. I froze in place and scanned the area. I called out, but my voice echoed back at me, distorted. The echo sounded strange, almost unnatural. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I dropped the sticks I was holding, sprinting away. As I ran, I could hear more twigs snapping behind me. My heart raced in terror. After running for several minutes, the sound stopped. I thought I was safe, but when I turned around to check, I realized that was a huge mistake. I came face to face with a giant creature, a wolf-like being standing on two legs, its body covered in fur, but its eyes were almost human. And it looked at me with what seemed like a grin, showing rows of sharp teeth that seemed ready to tear through anything. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not stopping until I reached the campsite. When I finally collapsed next to my best friend, Sarah, I was crying uncontrollably. She asked what was wrong, but I could barely speak. I pointed toward the woods where I had come from. Everything went black, and I woke up the next morning in my tent, surrounded by concerned faces. I tried to explain, but all I could say was that I saw a huge wolf. That was all they would ever know. The third day, I stayed in my tent, too afraid to go outside. I was terrified of encountering that creature again. Even now, I avoid going too deep into the woods. If you ever find yourself in the forest and feel watched, or if you hear something strange, just leave. Run and never look back. This is a story from my grandparents and my aunt. When my family goes camping, my grandpa can sleep anywhere, seriously. But if he tells you it's time to pack up and leave, you better listen. You grab your things and get in the car right away. I think my grandparents and my aunt, who was around 7 or 8 years old at the time, were on their way to Kentucky to pick up my mom and uncle. They had gone on a trip with friends for a vacation. It was getting late in the afternoon when my grandparents pulled into a gas station in the mountains of Kentucky. As a side note, it was probably near a small town they liked to visit. They enjoyed sightseeing, so it wasn't odd for them to take a little detour during their trips. They asked the woman at the counter if there was a place nearby where they could camp for the night. She told them there was a gated campground about 5 miles down the road. My grandpa said, "All right," and they drove the 5 miles. By now, my grandma was starting to feel uneasy. She asked my grandpa if he was sure about staying there. He said yes, probably because he was tired of driving and didn't care where they stayed. They pulled up to the gate, and it was locked. There was a sign saying, "Welcome, help yourself, and pay in the morning at the office." My grandpa had my grandma get out of the truck to open the gate. He drove the camper through, and she closed the gate behind them. She got back in the truck, and they drove down a long, steep hill. At the bottom, they found a campsite, parked the camper, and started to get ready for the evening. This is where things started to feel off. While my grandma was cooking dinner, she looked up and saw my aunt playing outside. My grandpa was walking up and down the campsite, muttering to himself. Finally, he grabbed my aunt, put her in the camper, and told my grandma in a frantic voice to stop what she was doing and pack everything up. He said they had to leave now. My grandma was confused but did as he said. She quickly packed everything up, got my aunt settled, and asked my grandpa what was wrong. He said, "We can't stay here. We need to leave." He started the truck and drove back up the steep hill, speeding up as he went. They reached the gate again, and my grandma had to get out and open it for them. After that, They drove for about an hour before finally stopping at a well-lit truck stop. The next day, when they reached their destination, they told their friends about the gated campground. One of their friends reacted with shock and said that people had gone missing in that area before. My grandpa was visibly shaken. He kept thanking God for his instincts. When they got back to Michigan, they learned that in the 2 weeks before they passed through, 8 people had gone missing in that exact area. They had almost stayed there. My grandpa was thankful he trusted his gut. Back in 2020, I went to Europe with 4 friends, and we decided to visit the Ukrainian town of Pripyat. Before our trip, we made sure to get the proper clearance and brought radiation counters to ensure we stayed in safe areas. We thought spending 1 day there wouldn't be too risky as long as we stuck together. Our plan was to explore, camp for the night, and leave early the next day. Unfortunately, I wish it had been that simple. When we arrived, my friend Kevin pointed out how eerie and quiet the place was. The clock still read 11:55, and we soon came across the deserted amusement park. The bumper cars sat motionless, the Ferris wheel creaked, and a strange stillness hung in the air. It felt as if some huge force had come along and wiped out everyone who once lived here. Our radiation counters showed low readings, which seemed like a good sign, but we were warned that if any of us began feeling strange, we needed to leave immediately. Then my friend Brandon mentioned that the animals in the area had been badly affected by the radiation. Not long after, we spotted a lone wolf wandering nearby. We kept our distance, observing it from afar. When it turned to face us, we quickly looked away to avoid provoking it. But when I dared to glance back for a split second, I noticed something unsettling about its eyes. I'm no expert in animal behavior, but I'm sure that the wolf's eyes were different. They were unnaturally wide, and I couldn't distinguish between the cornea, iris, and pupil. It appeared to be blind, but it was still sniffing the air, probably aware of our presence. Fortunately, it eventually wandered off without attacking. Brandon suggested we find somewhere to set up camp in one of the nearby buildings. "I'm not sure what it is," he said, "but I feel like something doesn't want us here." The others agreed, all of us still shaken from the encounter with the wolf. We eventually found an empty building that had low radiation levels and a roof overhead, so we decided to settle there for the night. What happened next, though, is something I'll never forget. Before I continue, I want to clarify that I felt fine. No headaches, no dizziness, no nausea, or any other signs of radiation sickness. So it wasn't that. It wasn't a hallucination either. I woke up abruptly to a strange moaning sound, like a lawnmower running out of fuel. I was about to ask if anyone else heard it when I noticed the others were already sitting up, listening intently. "Okay," I said. "We can all agree we heard that." Brandon swallowed nervously, then spoke. "I think I know what doesn't want us here." He pointed behind us, and we all turned to see what he was talking about. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was over 6 feet tall with reddened skin. Its eyes were completely red, and from its left arm, there was what looked like a twisted, deformed limb. The sight was so disturbing that we all screamed in fear. "Does radiation even do that?" I asked, but before anyone could answer, the others grabbed their things and fled. I followed close behind, but when I dared to look back, the figure was still standing there, swaying and groaning as though it couldn't control its own body. After we returned home, Brandon went to visit his family, while Grant and I tried to rationalize what we'd seen, concluding it was possibly a victim of radiation. Kevin and Maria, the other 2, refused to talk about it. None of us ever brought it up again until now. So, if you ever find yourself in Pripyat, keep your eyes and ears open. The radiation is still there, and some people either couldn't or wouldn't leave. You might encounter someone who's been badly affected, so in all honesty, it might not be the safest place to visit. I've always had a deep interest in the paranormal and supernatural. It's something I've always been passionate about, and I've spent countless hours researching and learning about these topics. Back when I was in middle school, I had to write an essay on any subject we chose, as long as we did research and included plenty of information. While most of my classmates chose typical topics like fishing or crafts, I went for something a bit different. I decided to research skinwalkers. After watching an episode of a paranormal show where they visited Skinwalker Canyon, I became fascinated by these creatures and spent a lot of time reading up on folklore. My final essay turned out to be about 12 pages long, and I was extremely proud of it. Some of my classmates thought it was strange, and a few of the teachers were concerned, but it didn't cause me any trouble. Looking back, it was kind of ironic that I chose this topic, because what I learned about skinwalkers didn't help me understand what happened to me that summer. The summer between 6th and 7th grade, my family moved. It wasn't far, only about a 15-minute drive, so we could be closer to my grandmother. The house we lived in was surrounded by thick woods, which my younger brother and I spent a lot of time exploring. We didn't have a huge yard, but we did have a large patch of forest to roam and play in, and we knew every inch of it. At the time, I loved being outside, and I'd spend hours in the woods, especially with my dogs. Our house was built on a small hill, and at the back of the house, there was a small porch that overlooked the woods. It was just big enough for a grill or a few camping chairs. I'd often sit out there in the evenings, listening to the sounds of the forest as it grew dark. The trees were about 20 yards away, and the angle of the porch meant I'd be about 6 or 7 feet above the ground when looking down at the trees. One evening in July, I was out on the porch as usual. I'd been sitting there reading one of my favorite books, just relaxing. I was around 12 years old at the time, and I had trouble focusing for long periods. After finishing my reading, I stood up and leaned on the railing, gazing out into the woods. A few moments later, I heard something moving through the trees. Since we lived so close to the forest, we often had deer wander through, sometimes even close to the house if we stayed quiet. Naturally, I went still, waiting to see if a deer would appear. After about half a minute, I saw a pale, slender figure emerge from the bushes. For a brief moment, I was excited to see such a beautiful animal, but that feeling quickly turned to confusion. This deer didn't look quite right. Its neck was unnaturally long, and its legs were thin and spindly. I couldn't imagine how it was able to support itself on legs that thin. It seemed like it should collapse under its own weight. But somehow, it stood steady on its hooves as it walked. As the creature got closer, I felt a strange sense of fascination mixed with confusion, but no fear. When it was almost directly in front of me, I realized that no deer would get so close to a person like this. It stared right at me, and I could tell it knew I was there. A wave of unease washed over me. Maybe it was sick or had rabies. I figured there was no way it could get on the porch with me, but still, I slowly stepped back from the railing, went inside, and locked the door behind me. I thought about it for a moment, then shrugged it off as just a sick deer. I told my mom about the strange deer, worried for the safety of our dogs and my brother. I didn't want them to get sick or hurt. My mom immediately became concerned and kept my brother and the dogs inside for the next few days. We moved away that week, but it had nothing to do with the encounter. I never saw that deer again, or any deer like it. It's been years since that night, and I had almost forgotten about it, until just a few nights ago. My interest in the paranormal hasn't faded, and I still keep researching these strange creatures. While I was browsing through cryptid videos online, I came across something called Not Deer. Intrigued, I searched for more information, and after a few minutes, the memories of that night came rushing back. The creature's appearance and behavior matched perfectly with what I was learning about Not Deer. Suddenly, the strange creature I had encountered as a child started to make sense. What I thought was just an imaginative story from my younger years had actually been true. I felt a bit embarrassed that I didn't realize what I had seen back then, especially considering how much time I'd spent studying these creatures. But instead of letting that embarrassment stop me, I decided to share my experience. If I come across another one of these creatures, I'll make sure to share more details. Ever since realizing what I had encountered, I found myself gazing into the woods, wondering if I'll spot those big eyes again. This story takes place in the summer of 2012, when I was 13 years old. I lived in a small rural town in the Midwest, surrounded by vast fields of corn. Our house was nestled in the countryside, and the tall stalks of corn filled the air with a whisper all summer long, until harvest time came. Growing up surrounded by fields like this, the corn never really bothered me. But this summer was different. I was the only one of my friends who lived out in the country, so they would often come over to my house to do things that weren't possible in town. I loved the outdoors, and so did my best friend, Max. During that summer, Max spent a lot of time at my house. We'd walk down to the creek to fish, swim in my pool, have bonfires, build little shelters in the yard, and later, when it got dark, we'd go inside and play video games. But one weekend, we decided to do something a little different. We camped out in the backyard. We set up a small tent and a little fire pit. Our property wasn't huge, but it had a decent-sized backyard and plenty of trees, so it felt like a good spot to pretend we were in the forest. If anything went wrong or we got scared, we could always run up to the house. Not that we expected to feel scared. After setting up camp, we made some food over the fire and went to bed early. Normally, I would have been uneasy about camping alone, but Max was with me, and I also had my dog, Max. Yes, that's right, my dog and my best friend shared the same name. It was a little confusing, but it worked. We were lying in our sleeping bags with my dog outside the tent, roaming the yard like he usually did. I don't remember much after that. We must have fallen asleep for a while because I didn't wake up or move around much. It wasn't until the middle of the night when things started to feel strange. I woke up suddenly to my dog barking furiously. His barking was loud and vicious, which was unusual for him. Max and I both knew that my dog was normally calm and never barked aggressively, so this immediately caught my attention. As I rubbed my eyes and tried to wake up, I could hear something else. There was a strange, erratic whistling in the air, like a call, but it didn't have any pattern to it. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It definitely sounded human, but it was unsettling. I thought maybe it was my dad playing a prank, but it made me uneasy. I woke Max up, and he immediately heard the whistling, too. We exchanged nervous glances, both of us too scared to say anything. My first instinct was to check my phone, and when I did, I saw it was 3 a.m. That's when things felt even more eerie, because I knew it was the witching hour when strange things were supposed to happen. Max was freaking out. "What is that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I answered, feeling the fear settle in my chest. Max suggested I call my dad to see if it was him making the noise, so I did. The phone rang 3 times before my dad answered, sounding groggy. "What's up, son?" "I'm trying to sleep," he said. I froze, realizing that the whistling was still going on, even though my dad was speaking to me on the phone. I knew then it wasn't him. I asked if my mom was with him, and he confirmed she was. I told him about the whistling and the dog barking, and he just brushed it off, saying, "It's probably a bird." I felt my anger rise. I told Max that we had to leave, but my dad wasn't going to help, so we decided to head back to the house. Max was terrified, and we ran, not daring to look in the direction of the cornfields, but I could tell the whistling was coming from that way. We reached the back door, and I saw my dog, still barking toward the fields, staying close to the house. I opened the door, and we rushed inside. I stood at the door, calling for my dog to come inside, but he wouldn't listen. Instead, he started running off toward the whistling. I ran after him, but as I reached him, he bolted away, running toward whatever it was out there. Couldn't believe it. I shouted his name, slammed the door shut, and locked it behind me. Inside, we locked all the doors, shaking with fear. My dad came down and we told him what happened. He didn't believe us, and he seemed to think we had imagined everything. I was furious and told him to listen for himself. He opened a window and stood there, but there was nothing. No barking, no whistling. He shrugged and went back to bed, suggesting we do the same. But we couldn't. We were too scared. We spent hours online, trying to figure out what the noise could have been. Nothing we found matched the sound we heard. Eventually, we tried to rationalize it, telling ourselves it was just coyotes, but deep down, we knew that wasn't the case. The next day, my parents went to work, leaving Max and me at home alone. We decided to go look for my dog. When we went outside, we found him running around, completely fine, no signs of injury. He seemed perfectly happy. We figured he must have chased off whatever it was that had scared us the night before. Feeling a little braver, we pulled out our dirt bikes and started riding around the property. Everything was going fine until I came around a corner and saw Max stopped in the middle of the track. His bike was turned off and he signaled for me to do the same. I shut off my engine and asked him what was wrong. I heard it again," he said, pointing toward the cornfield. His eyes were wide with fear. At first, I thought he was joking, but when I saw the terror in his face, I knew he wasn't. I was scared again, too. We spent the rest of the day indoors, too afraid to go back outside. To this day, I haven't heard the whistling again. I'm 23 now, married with a daughter, and I don't live in that house anymore. I hope I never hear that noise again. "13 years ago, when I was 33, I lived alone in the mountains of Wyoming. I grew up hunting just like my father and grandfather, so I was no stranger to the wilderness. One morning, I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep into the forest. After a quick mug of coffee, I packed up my gear, grabbed my belt with a .500 Magnum holstered, and called my brother. I asked him to pick up my dog and take her home for me. Then I hit the road. The drive there was uneventful, but when I arrived at the trailhead, everything was eerily still. I thought it was just because I had just arrived, so I moved forward. As I hiked, there was no sign of life. No birds, no bugs, not even the rustling of leaves. It was unsettling. After about 2 hours of this, I began to feel uneasy. I kept my hand on my gun, convinced I was being watched by something. 3 hours into my hike, I finally reached the campsite. As I set up my tent, the silence suddenly lifted, and the sounds of nature returned, much to my relief. The campsite itself was breathtaking, set atop a ridge with a view of the small town below. I tossed my bag inside the tent and started unpacking, but then, just as quickly, everything went silent again. The stillness didn't last long. Soon, the wind began to rustle the trees, and I set up my sleeping bag. I stepped outside to get some food, pulling a can of beans from my pack and hanging the rest of my supplies in a tree. That's when I heard a twig snap. I turned around, my hand instinctively going to my gun, and scanned the woods. I saw nothing. A sigh of relief escaped me, and I shrugged off the tension. As I tried to start a fire to cook, I heard more rustling. This time it was heavy, rapid footsteps. I pulled out my gun again and spun around. Through the trees, I saw something I can only describe as a nightmare. It had the body of a goat, its legs and horns, but it stood on 2 feet. Its body was covered in brown fur, and its arms were humanoid. But its face looked like a kangaroo's, and its eyes radiated pure malice. It stepped closer, and I raised my gun, firing a warning shot into the air. The creature screamed, a mixture of a fox's cry, a deer's mating call, and the most horrifying human scream I could ever imagine. I blinked, and the creature was right in front of me. Its snout was almost touching mine, its cold yellow eyes staring directly into me. I froze. The air around me seemed thick with the tension, and I just knew that any movement would cost me my life. I controlled my breathing, but before I knew it, the creature shoved me to the ground, never breaking eye contact. I sprang to my feet and stood my ground. It moved toward me again, and its scream shook the trees around us. I raised my hands and yelled back. It didn't flinch. I pointed my gun directly at its throat and screamed once more, demanding it back off. It didn't budge, so I pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot rang in my ears. The creature hesitated, then turned and sprinted back into the forest. My heart pounded as I scrambled to pack up my things, but each time I looked up, I saw it watching me from the trees, its yellow eyes gleaming in the distance. I hurried down the trail to my motorcycle, and the thing followed me all the way. When I finally revved the engine and sped off, going at least 30 miles per hour over the limit, I could still hear its terrifying scream echo in the distance as I hit the main road back to town. Now, with a wife and 2 kids, part of me wants to go back. I want to finish what I started, track that thing down, and bring its head home as a trophy. But I know better. I can't afford to throw my life away for the hunt of a creature that might just be too much for anyone to defeat. I was followed by something strange for over 4 years. These events occurred when I was between 10 and 14 years old. I wasn't one to fully believe in the supernatural, but I've always acknowledged that even if I hadn't experienced something unusual myself, it might exist, just waiting for the right moment to cross my path. This was one of those moments. The first time I encountered this presence was when I was 10 years old. At the time, I lived in the southern United States. My best friend, his uncle, my uncle, and I were on an overnight camping trip at one of our favorite spots, which was a short distance from a quiet creek. It was remote enough to feel private, but still near enough to the main road for a quick departure if needed. The day went well. We enjoyed a long walk by the creek and settled in for the night. My friend and I shared a tent, while our uncles shared another. I've always struggled to sleep outdoors, so I was the last one to drift off. Around 10:30 p.m., I finally fell asleep. At some point in the night, I woke abruptly and glanced at my watch. It was 1:45 a.m. I had no idea why I woke up until I heard movement outside the tent. At first, I thought it might be one of the adults stepping out for some reason, but I quickly dismissed the idea when I heard the noise continuing without the usual sounds of a tent zipper or footsteps on the gravel. Being a 10-year-old with a wild imagination, I buried myself deeper into my sleeping bag, gripped by fear. Then I heard it, a sharp, high-pitched sound that reminded me of a fox's call. It wasn't a howl, but a series of barks and whimpers. Whatever it was kept circling the tent, occasionally brushing against the fabric and sniffing loudly. My friend remained fast asleep, and I didn't hear any movement from the other tent either. The creature stayed close for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Its calls went unanswered by any other animals, which struck me as odd. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I somehow managed to fall asleep again. The next morning, I was the first to wake up. Eager to understand what had happened, I searched the area for signs of an animal, tracks, fur, or droppings. Yet there was nothing, not even in the soft dirt or sandy creek bed nearby. When I asked my friend and our uncles if they had heard anything unusual, they all claimed to have slept through the night. The only thing we found was a single barefoot human footprint near the creek. We packed up and left after breakfast, and nothing else noteworthy occurred that day. However, a powerful summer storm hit the area the following evening. The creek swelled, completely submerging the spot where we had camped just 2 days earlier. At the time, I chalked it up to coincidence. But my second experience made me question that assumption. The second encounter happened about a year later, when I was 11. It was another warm summer night, and I had started sleeping on our screened porch to enjoy the cool breeze. That night, I fell asleep early, only to wake up abruptly around 12:30 a.m., feeling uneasy. Then I heard it again, the same sharp cries as before. This time, I mustered the courage to look. The porch faced the front yard, where the sound seemed to originate. Through the mesh screen, I saw a dark figure hunched over, roughly the size of an adult person. It moved on two legs, shuffling along before vanishing behind a cluster of trees. The cries continued for a while before fading into the distance. The next day was stormy, eerily similar to the weather after my first encounter. This pattern repeated in my third and final experience, which occurred when I was 14. By then, we had moved to the Pacific Northwest. One afternoon, while walking home from the bus stop, I noticed movement on the far side of the road. Coyote stood there, staring straight at me. His gaze felt unnervingly intelligent. I broke eye contact, but every time I glanced back, it was still watching. After what felt like forever, it turned and trotted into the woods. That night, a violent storm shook the area, and the next morning, I discovered a tree had fallen just feet from my bedroom window. To this day, I don't know what this entity was. Coyotes are common across the country, but I'm certain this was no ordinary animal. Was it a warning, or did it bring the storms with it? I may never know, but whenever I hear that familiar call, I'm transported back to those nights and the mysteries they carried.